Alright, hey everyone, this is going to be the lesson on, go way back up here, lesson 5 of Unit 5, the environment and genetics affect animal survival. Okay, so first it has zebras, sub-zebras. It says they live on grassy plains, they live in family groups. The family groups include one male and several females, with the female's offspring. Alright, so think of 3 reasons why zebras might be fighting each other. They could be fighting each other for, I'm assuming these are 2 males and they're either fighting for dominance so they can mate, because it's saying that it's one male and several females, or maybe it's a younger male fighting an older male, or maybe it's just zebras fighting over territory and land. So there's the reasons. Okay, describing animal reproduction. There are dragonflies reproducing. Very exciting. So, kind of based off of the last lesson, write asexual reproduction, sexual, or both to describe the sexual reproductive process of each animal. So remember, sexually means it's 2 organisms, and asexual is 1, or it's like reproducing by itself. It's like cloning itself, essentially. So an eastern gray squirrel, this is the example, I'll go to this one. The spoonbill bird. After a male and female spoonbill mate. Okay, it's saying they're mating, so that's clearly sexual. There's 2 of them. New Zealand mud snail. Female mud snails they're born genetically identical with genetically identical embryos inside of them. They can also mate with a male to produce young snails from fertilized eggs. So they have these identical embryos, which are essentially already good to go snails, are genetically identical to them. So that's asexual because those are basically clones. And then, but they can also mate with a male. So both. Tree frogs. The female lays the eggs, the male fertilizes them. That's sexual. The walking stick. Female insect sticks can produce offspring from unfertilized eggs, so they can take unfertilized eggs, right, and they can produce offspring from that. So that would be asexual because they don't need anything else. They can also mate with male to make fertilized eggs, so both. And salmon. Salmon eggs are laid by a female and fertilized by a male. This is sexual. There's actually a lot of animals that do that, kind of like lay eggs, lots of fish. They kind of like lay the eggs places, and then males come along and fertilize them, and that's how that works. So sexual reproduction in animals. So this photo talks about what behavior do all of these animals have in common. So I said, based off of just reading these real quick, they're all somehow protecting and caring for their offspring, right? This Joey, or the baby kangaroo, is in the pouch. This mother seal is taking care of the younger seal by feeding it. The mother guards the eggs and then brings food later. Some fish will watch over their eggs after they're fertilized, so they're kind of protecting it. And then, how do you think its behavior contributes to the animal's reproductive success? So, regardless of how they end up, reproducing in the first place, taking care of your offspring after obviously would help boost their reproductive success. Fish that if the fish were just to leave the eggs, right, then anything that would come along and find the eggs could just eat them. But if the fish sticks around, it can kind of scare away other things that might eat it. Similarly, the other animals they're doing similar things. They're somehow helping to care for their young, so their young can grow to get older, stronger, whatever. So asexual reproduction in animals. So again, this is asexual reproduction is one that involves one parent. I guess I could just highlight the whole thing. Would have thought. One parent. And so it is usually just copying its genes to make a new one. So this talks about examples of that happening. So there is this this question asks what environmental stimulus might result in asexual reproduction in these animals. And then it gives you some words and things to think about. So these can reproduce by regeneration. So if it's split or cut into pieces, it can grow into new animals. So that's super helpful because if it gets injured, right, or if primarily if it's injured, then it could reproduce itself that way. So if something comes and bites it in half, right, it can like split into two new organisms. The sponge can reproduce asexually by producing structures that are able to survive harsh environmental conditions. So this would be good maybe if there's a lack of mates, because they can, all of these essentially are good for lack of mates because they're producing asexually. So, if there were a lack of mates, that would be helpful. But this one additionally would have harsh environmental conditions in the ocean would be like temperature changes. So that could, offspring could help survive temperature changes. And then these Komodo dragons can reproduce asexually through a process that does not require fertilization of the eggs by a male. So this would be a major lack of mates one. So if you can't find a male, then it could produce asexually. But that doesn't really have anything to do with like injury or the temperature change or something like that. The zebra is a mammal like the eastern gray squirrel and the seal. How do you think a zebra reproduces and raises its young? So I know all of these things: mammals, gray squirrels, seals. Generally, they are reproducing sexually. And it talks about how another way that I know that they reproduce sexually is it said at the very beginning that males live in groups of families with multiple females. So I'm just assuming that's what's happening from that. I'm inferring. So evaluating reproductive strategies. So it's got anemones, right? And it talks about, hold on, let me go back up here. I did this a week ago and I'm making the video, so. Oh, yeah. So sea anemones, right? So what the sea anemones will do is they form these giant clusters in their groups. That's what it says up here. So they're found in dense colonies that cover large areas, and they form these groups. And each group is genetically identical because they are reproducing asexually, or they can reproduce asexually. And it also says they can reproduce asexually by splitting into two pieces. They can also reproduce sexually by releasing sperm and eggs into the water, and then a fertilized egg develops into the larva that will eventually settle on the ocean floor and start a new colony. And then this question is saying, how do both types of reproduction influence where aggregating anemone colonies establish and grow? So imagine you've got, here's kind of what that means. So let's say you've got like an anemone, ta-da, and you have one. Okay, so this anemone can reproduce asexually. It can keep, they can keep reproducing and spreading out asexually. So they're producing. But then they can also fertilize and send out, like it says, into the water larvae that will settle on the ocean floor. So now here's the thing. If you have another group, right, of anemones over here, right, and these are genetically identical because these are also producing asexually, and then somehow the genetics from these two meets, and those become another different anemone and its genetics are different, and so this one now can also spread out on its own, right? It's a product of the purple and the green anemones, but it because it was initially from these two producing sexually, but then it can produce asexually. So then it starts growing out its same, right? And so then they can essentially the colonies establish and grow because they can compete with one another because they can either grow themselves and compete with one another, or they can reproduce sexually and then produce genetically different offspring that will go off and reproduce. So it's kind of like um, a very successful strategy because they can spread really easily for multiple ways. Okay, exploration 2. We've got talking about reproductive success and in regards to animal behaviors. So how does the behavior of the bird's offspring contribute to the reproductive success? I'm sure many of you have seen videos or whatever where it has, baby birds and they're just like crying out constantly. And so, the baby birds having that behavior would make the parent, first of all, the parent can hear them. They know that they're hungry. They know that they need something. It's just like a human baby, right? A lot of times people say, if you have a human baby and it's crying, it's hungry, it wants to be held, or it needs to be changed, because there's really not that many things that could be going wrong with it. So, but the fact that they're upset tells you something needs to be done. So, and we also have, so here we have courtship behaviors. Courtship behaviors are attempts by animals to attract mates, courting. And there's some examples here. What qualities do these males have that encourage females to accept them as mates? So here we have elks, right? Elks, they have these giant antlers. What is the point of antlers? Well, the point of antlers, it says here, is they fight with other males and they chase off predators. So they protect their offspring and their females, and they also, because they're fighting one another, right? And that, if multiple elk are fighting, and then the one that wins, that one gets to reproduce. So that is kind of demonstrating that the stronger elk has good genetic fitness because it is theoretically more fit than the other elk. So that's why they would want to mate with that one. Male peacocks have long, beautiful tail feathers. The feathers are heavy and they have to be strong to carry them. So this is a good example of good genetic fitness. If you have a huge tail, you have to have good genetic fitness because the tail will look nice, it will be symmetrical, and the bird will be healthy enough to hold it up. This spider is presenting a female with an insect that's wrapped in silk. So this spider is demonstrating that it can provide a meal. Birds sing for 9. Birds sing for many reasons, but male birds produce particular songs to attract females. What other benefits might these loud vocalizations provide to the male? So other things that it could provide is they could communicate with other birds, that there's predators. They could identify sources of food, particularly for males. I guess they could also tell other males that it's their kind of like territory, so the other males would know where to avoid. 10. How could the fighting behavior of male zebras provide information to female zebras about reproductive success? That kind of goes back to right here what I just said about the elk. So these fighting zebras, what does that tell the females? It can demonstrate to the females who is more physically fit, which in theory, if you're an animal living in the wilderness, then physical fitness is extremely important because you want your offspring to survive. And if you are mating with another animal with good physical fitness, then your offspring would also have good physical fitness. Parenting behaviors. So now we're talking about, these were behaviors of courtship behaviors. Now we're doing parenting behaviors. Parenting behaviors are attempts by animals to ensure that the offspring survives. So animals have behaviors that help them find mates, right? And then they also have once they have mated, they have behaviors that help them raise their young. So has these different animals. Our squirrel is building a nest. The tiger is feeding offspring, which you might not notice at first, but there are tiny tigers over here feeding. The brown bear and the cubs, like the older bears, grizzly bears, are teaching the younger bears or the brown bears to catch fish. Well, I'm pretty sure this is not a brown bear. I'm pretty sure these are grizzly bears because grizzly bears have this hump, but whatever. Penguins and caracara, okay, they're defending offspring. They're screaming at it for some reason, but they're not screaming at it because they're building a nest or feeding or teaching things. So, okay, and now we have this doing math for analyzing female mate choice, and so it talks about guppies, and it has 3 experiments. All right, and it says use the data from the tables to describe the 3 experiments in your own words. How does the female choice? Why is the female choice what it chooses? So if you look at these things right here, here's the first experiment right here, and you have large and small-tailed males. And so you can see how the large is 78%, the small is 22%. So more large-tailed were chosen over small-tailed. Then you have experiment number 2. Experiment number 2, we have large and medium. In this case, right, large is bigger than medium, and still the females chose more large than the medium. And then finally in experiment 3, you have medium and small. Okay, well, here more females chose medium, and medium is more larger than small. So the takeaway from all 3 experiments was that more often, right, not every time, right, because it's like this is like 2/3 to 1/3, but more often the females will choose the male with the longer tail. So 13 says, why might the percentage of female preferences for medium-sized tails be greater in experiment 3 than it was for 2? So it's saying in experiment 3, medium was 65%. Experiment 2, medium was 32%. Why is it different? Well, that's because, right, in experiment 2, it was large tails versus medium tails. So the medium tail in experiment 2 was the smaller tail, so it had a lower percentage. Now in experiment 3, it was medium versus small tails. In this experiment, the medium-tailed males were the larger males, so they have a greater percentage. And then in a population of guppies, is there an equal number of short-tailed, medium-tailed, and large-tailed males? Oh, it says there is an equal number. So, you know, like 10, 10, 10, or 100, 100, 100, or whatever. Based on the data, which group of males would have the highest probability of reproductive success and why? So it would be the large-tailed males. The large-tailed males would have the most reproductive success because you can see how in all of these choices, right, no matter what experiment it was, the larger option out of the 2 won out. So in this case, you have all 3 of them present, but our data suggests that the females will more often pick the males with the longer tails. So they would do that. Why is more about the fish. So if the fish has a longer tail, it kind of goes back to the behaviors, right? The behaviors of it would mean more genetic fitness. It could possibly mean that they can swim faster, things like that. So that is what they'd be looking for. Okay, lastly, exploration 3. Do you think that the bowl provides a healthy environment for the goldfish? Nope, because it says right up in here in this paragraph that goldfish will eat however much you give them and that they create lots of waste. So this thing has barely, first of all, it can't even move, but you know, it would create lots of waste for the small space. what factors might limit the growth of the goldfish living in a large pond? So if it was living in a large pond, what might limit its growth? So that could be lots of things. It could be water conditions. It could be like pollutants in the water. It could be how much oxygen's in the water. It could be literally the size of the pond, how many other fish are living in it, what food's available to it, all those types of things. And so this is kind of going into genetic factors that affect animal survival. So and this pretty much talks about how sexual reproduction in animals results in genetic variation. So we're getting into the main difference and the advantage of producing sexually is that it produces different genetics in offspring. And so it goes down here and talks about gray wolves a bit, and then it talks about dogs. And it's talking about how all dogs, big, small, whatever, they all essentially came from gray wolves. Like you can plug in their DNA to machines and see they're all from gray wolves. They're all just domesticated differently. So, and this talks about how we did that. 12,000 years ago, we started taking basically wolves and domesticating them, making them, and then taking them and you could breed them together. And, we still do this today. That's why you have like mixes or purebred dogs. You can breed them together and they get kind of mixes of their traits. So it says compare and contrast the traits that would be desirable in a dog that helps police locate explosives and provides companionship for the elderly. So, this gives some examples of dogs, but I said things that would be good for helping police locate explosives would be things like they have really good smelling, like this dog has really big ears, and a lot of times the dogs with big ears are so when they put their heads down, it funnels the air to their nose so they can smell really good. They'd want to be really well behaved, things like that. But so maybe this dog would be really good for finding explosives, but maybe this dog would not be that great for helping the elderly because it's really small. So you couldn't use that dog to help carry something or really pull you along or jump in the protect you. It's dinky. So 18. Dog breeders choose mates in an effort to produce offspring with desired traits. How does this compare with the way that advantageous traits in wolves get passed to an offspring? Okay, so with wolves, right, wolves are still naturally reproducing in the wild, and they are kind of doing up where we talked about in the past. They're looking for wolves based off of their fitness levels or their coloring, things that to these wolves seems appealing, right? So to us, we think that, oh my gosh, this dog is so tiny and it's like all dinky and like hot dog shaped. And what if we could get this dog to have more pointy nose like a greyhound? And then sometime, or oh my gosh, what if its ears were even more floppy? So that would be so cute. We could sell it to all the rich people to carry around in their purses if we made them so tiny. So it's, dog breeders are thinking of all these weird combos and then they breed the different dogs together and see what kind of traits they get. So if you took, this dog and a dog with even bigger ears and bred them together, you would get a mix of their traits. And so that's kind of what they're doing. Okay, so environmental factors that affect animal growth. So genetics are the only thing that affect animals' growth. There are also environmental factors, and that's kind of where we go back to the goldfish, living in a tiny versus a big area. So those can be things. Generally, those are things like if the environment is so usually you're thinking about things like the weather and the area. What else lives around it? Pollution, overcrowding, pollution, habitat destruction. All of the types of things that might happen to the land that an animal lives on can affect how well it grows and survives, right? If it has more food and more area, it could probably survive better than if its land is crowded and there's people are living everywhere and stuff like that. So we've got adaptations to the environment. And this talks about these pronghorn antelope. I'm talking about how they are considered living fossils because the species has remained mostly unchanged for thousands of years. Probably just because of the way that they live and where they live. And they live in the, what's it called down here? It talks about Sonoran pronghorn. So I'm assuming that that's what this is, the Sonoran pronghorn. I'm not sure if this is the same exact picture, but so I looked up. It says it's an endangered species that lives in the Sonoran Desert. So I looked up the Sonoran Desert. Right? If you don't know what the Sonoran Desert is, let's look it up. Sonoran Desert. Doo-doo. This is good enough. We got a picture of where it is. So the Sonoran Desert is right in this area. Okay, so you can see it's really kind of Southern California, Arizona, and Mexico. And then if you go actually back to this article, it does list some major cities and things like this in that location. And it was going to organize research into a graphic organizer that links environmental stressors, so things that are stressful for the animal and the environment, with impacts on the pronghorns. And it said, because we're trying to identify environmental stressors that threaten the Sonoran pronghorn throughout its range. So these are 3 things I came up with. So one of the environmental stressor was building development. So that's basically, I mean, I wrote them down here, but building development is there's lots of buildings there's actually lots of cities, and in some areas in the Sonoran Desert, there's major cities and towns and things, and those obviously get rid of all the area for them to live on, and it also produces dirtier air. I said fencing and walls because this is all along the border of the United States and Mexico. So there's lots of barriers. You might not know this, but there already are actually lots of barriers along the border. There's lots of fences in certain areas and things like that. All of these types of things would prevent, right? It's like half and half, this desert. If there's a giant fence running through the center of this, that prevents the longhorns from going from one area of the climate to another area of the same climate. So it essentially just cuts in half their access to their land, right? If you're in Mexico, you might be stuck in Mexico. If you're in the United States as an animal, you're stuck in this area as the animal. So, and then water use. So water use, which we kind of go into later in later lessons about our effect on water use and people's use on water. But anywhere where people live, right, people are going to build dams, make reservoirs, use lakes, blah, blah, blah. They're going to use up all this water, and those types of things would further decrease the resources available to the pronghorns. So those are my examples. And evidence notebook. Zebras live in one group of several females or groups of young and weaker males. Why does this grouping of zebras lead to males fighting? It leads to males fighting because the younger ones want to be able to mate, so they fight the older ones, basically. Also, if there are 2 groups of zebras that come together, then the males would probably fight one another as well. And this is kind of a long question, but it's asking what you could do in this area of the Central Valley to provide an area for birds to live, because lots of it used to be wetlands, and kind of like the little wetland that's by our school, the sheep on sometimes, but every winter it floods, and then there's flowers everywhere, and that's a wetland. And a lot of those wetlands have been essentially just plowed down and turned into farmland. It says, write and present an argument that you could use to convince others to accept the solution put into action about solutions to the declining winter habitat in the Central Valley. And it says up here that they're declining because there's no more wetlands, basically. There's just farmland. So I said you could maybe take portions, right? Maybe like put like portions of the what used to be wetlands, like all this Central Valley area, and you could make little reserves all spread throughout the whole area. We have some in real life. We have some, but I'm, like if you speckled it with wildlife preserves, they wouldn't have to be too big, um, but they'd be spread out, and so you wouldn't be using much land for farm. We got lots of farmland, so you could take some of it and allocate it towards not farming, and then you would have more land for the fish. I mean, not for the fish. I'm thinking of this. I don't know why I said fish. For the, that's probably because I saw this. For the birds, and I guess there are fish that live in wetlands as well. And are these causes genetic or environmental? So an effect. A cow grows better than other cows when its herd is moved to a colder climate. So some of these might seem environmental because it seems like the colder climate is an environment, but if the colder climate was an environmental factor that made cows grow better, all the cows would be growing better. So these two right here, this one and this one, are kind of similar. A cow grows better, a bull grows better than other bulls during a warm summer. So these would be genetic because something about this particular cow or this particular bull is helping them to grow better in that area. The second one, young cattle do not grow well when a disease kills the grass. That's environmental because they don't have access to food in the grass, and so that's an environmental thing. Like the grass is part of their environment. And this last one, I think, or this one, the third one, I think you could argue either way. The calves are not growing well because of a parasite present in the herd. So depending on how the parasite is present, right? If the parasite is being passed from cow to cow, that could definitely be genetic because cows that might be immune genetically would not get the parasite. If the parasite was in something like food or something like affecting their food sources, then it could be environmental because it could be the genetics of the environment, but their environment doesn't have much food because of the parasite. So it depends on how you look at it, I think. Okay, last thing for this lesson is the antelope. And this is all about, it talks about what they eat, what their predators are, and finally the whole question is just use facts about the antelope to explain genetic and environmental factors that influence the production of the animals. So there's lots of things that affect the reproduction. You're kind of like wrapping it all together. So genetically, that the antelope with longer what do they call them, horns? The longer horns are probably going to reproduce more often, right? Because they are seen as more attractive to the females and they can fight better. And so those genetics are going to get passed on. It talks about how the younger animals, somewhere in here, it talks about how the young ones, a single fawn will stay inside the grass until it's ready to join the herd. So these are other genetic things, like if the single fawn for some reason decided that maybe its genetics made it more risky and it was just like, I'm not going to stay hidden in the grass, it would probably get killed more often. Another thing is that genetically speaking, the females are only giving birth to a single fawn at a time. So there's a kind of a long lifespan, right? They're probably only having a single fawn every year or so. So they're not reproducing terribly fast. Other things that affect it, like environmental things, are let's say it didn't rain very much one year, and so the grass was all super short. Well, now the fawns can't stay hidden in the grass because the grass isn't growing very well. So they're going to get caught by their predators, which are leopards and wild dogs, a lot easier. Or maybe if humans are hunting antelope too much, like this is actually true all across the United States for a long time, is with trophy hunting, right? People would go out all the time and they would hunt only the males, and because they wanted the horns and stuff. But then there's no males, and if you don't have any males, then it's harder for the females to reproduce. And so maybe if there weren't things in place that kept people from overhunting the males, you might not have the same number of males, or you could that could also affect it genetically. If you hunted down the biggest and the most fit males, then the only males that are left are perhaps not as physically good as the ones that were hunted. So all of these things come together in how these animals reproduce. So that is it. That's supposed to kind of like sum up all the thoughts.